Hey everyone, tonight we delve into one of the most haunting mysteries in the entire Star Wars galaxy, the untold story of what truly became of Darth Vader's soul after his death aboard the second Death Star. A tale of redemption interrupted, of spiritual chains that bind beyond the grave, and of a son's desperate quest to free his father from a fate worse than death itself. So before you settle in for this epic journey, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. But here's something that might surprise you. Nearly 79% of you watching right now aren't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars lore and want to help this channel grow, that subscribe button would mean the world to me. And if you're hungry for even more Star Wars mysteries and galactic lore, I highly recommend checking out my friend's incredible channel Netherworld. I've linked them in the description below. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about where in the galaxy you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected through these ancient stories, no matter how far apart we might be. Now dim those lights, find your most comfortable spot, and let us begin this tale that the Jedi archives dare not record. In the depths of space, where starlight dies and ancient secrets sleep, there exists a realm beyond the understanding of even the wisest Jedi Masters, a place where souls journey after death, where the Force itself holds dominion over the eternal fates of those who have passed beyond the veil of mortality. On that fateful night aboard the Death Star, as the Emperor's lightning coursed through Darth Vader's broken body, as Father lifted Son and cast his master into the abyss, something extraordinary occurred. The galaxy witnessed the redemption of an Anakin Skywalker, the return of the light to one who had dwelt in darkness for decades. Yet in that moment of triumph, in that instant where good conquered evil and love overcame hate, a terrible truth began to unfold. For you see, the dark side of the Force does not release its servants easily, and Vader's soul, despite his final act of heroism, despite the love that had rekindled in his mechanical heart, found itself caught in chains far stronger than the durasteel that had bound his flesh. Luke Skywalker stood vigil that night as his father's body burned upon a pyre on Endor's moon. He watched the flames consume the black armor, the respirator, all the terrible machinery that had kept Vader alive, and in those flickering shadows, he thought he glimpsed something that would haunt him for years to come. A figure in the flames, not burning but struggling, as if fighting against invisible bonds. The celebration of victory echoed through the forest that night. Ewok drums beating rhythms of joy, rebel pilots embracing in triumph. But Luke felt only a growing unease, a disturbance in the Force that seemed to whisper of unfinished business, of a redemption incomplete. Days later, when Anakin's Force ghost first appeared alongside Obi-Wan and Yoda, Luke noticed something the others could not see. His father's spirit flickered like a hologram, losing power. Sometimes, Anakin would begin to speak, only to fade away mid-sentence, his form dissolving into wisps of blue energy, before reforming moments later, confusion etched upon his spectral features. The dead do not suffer, old Yoda had once said, yet Anakin Skywalker's spirit seemed to be in agony, caught between worlds, neither fully at peace nor able to rest in the embrace of the cosmic Force. It was Ahsoka Tano who first spoke the words that would change everything. During a quiet moment on Coruscant, as Luke meditated in the ruins of the old Jedi Temple, she appeared to him in a vision more vivid than any dream. "Your father," she said, her voice heavy with ancient sorrow, "he is not free." "What do you mean?" Luke asked, though deep in his heart, he already feared the answer. "There are bonds that death cannot break," Ahsoka whispered, her form beginning to fade, even as she spoke. Chains forged in the dark side, strengthened by decades of servitude. The Emperor's final victory was not in ruling the galaxy, but in ensuring that even in death, his greatest servant would never truly escape. And with those words, she vanished, leaving Luke alone with a terrible understanding. His father's redemption, real though it was, had not been enough to free him from spiritual prison. Somewhere in the space between life and death, Anakin Skywalker remained a prisoner, and only one person in all the galaxy might possess the power to set him free. But the path to that freedom would lead Luke into realms darker than any Sith tomb, force him to confront enemies more ancient than the Empire itself, and challenge everything he thought he knew about the nature of the Force, of death, and of the price that must be paid for true redemption. The greatest battle for an Anakin Skywalker's soul was about to begin. 5 years had passed since the Battle of Endor, and the galaxy still bore the scars of Imperial rule. Yet in the quiet corners of space, where ancient temples crumbled beneath alien suns and forgotten archives gathered cosmic dust, a different kind of war was being waged. This was not a conflict of starships and blasters, but a battle for the very soul of the galaxy's most tragic figure. Luke Skywalker had changed in those years. Gone was the eager farm boy who had dreamed of adventure among the stars. In his place stood a man aged beyond his years by the weight of terrible knowledge, his blue eyes now holding depths of understanding that spoke of journeys into realms where few living beings had ever ventured. He stood now upon the observation deck of his personal starship, a modified YT-1300 freighter he had named the Wanderer, gazing out at the swirling mists of the Dagobah system. The small marshy world hung before him like a green jewel wrapped in perpetual twilight, its surface shrouded in the same mysterious fog that had concealed it from the Empire for so many years. Dagobah had become Luke's sanctuary in the months following his father's death. Here, in the humid darkness of ancient swamps, where the Force flowed as thick as the morning mist, he had hoped to find answers to the questions that haunted his dreams. The planet itself seemed to pulse with mystical energy, every gnarled root and moss-covered stone whispering secrets of power and wisdom accumulated over millennia. The Wanderer touched down in the same clearing where Luke had first landed as a young pilot seeking a Jedi Master. The landing ramp hissed open, releasing a cloud of recycled air into the humid atmosphere. Luke breathed deeply, tasting the rich, organic scent of decomposing vegetation and primordial life that defined this world. His footsteps squelched in the muddy ground as he made his way toward the small hut where Master Yoda had spent his final years in exile. The dwelling remained exactly as it had been on the day of Yoda's passing, a humble shelter that somehow contained more wisdom than the grandest libraries of the Old Republic. But Luke was not alone on this pilgrimage. 3 figures awaited him in the clearing, their forms translucent and shimmering with the ethereal light that marked them as one with the Force. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression grave in a way that Luke had rarely seen. Beside him, Master Yoda leaned heavily on his gimmer stick, his ancient eyes reflecting a sorrow deeper than the swamps around them. And between them, flickering like a candle in an ill wind, stood Anakin Skywalker. Luke's father appeared as he had in life during his final moments, free from the black armor, but bearing still the scars of his long servitude to the dark side. His face, though peaceful, bore an expression of profound confusion, as if he were constantly trying to remember something just beyond his reach. "Luke," Obi-Wan spoke first, his voice carrying across the clearing like a gentle breeze. "You have felt it too, haven't you? The disturbance in the Force that surrounds your father's spirit." Luke nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Anakin's flickering form. "He's trapped, somehow. I can sense his struggle, feel his pain echoing through the Force, but I don't understand how or why." "Understand. You must. That redemption and freedom are not always the same thing," Yoda said, his voice heavy with centuries of accumulated wisdom. "Powerful the dark side is, deep roots it sends into the soul of one who serves it long. Your father, pure of heart he became in his final moments, but the chains of his past broken they are not. Anakin himself tried to speak, his mouth moving as if forming words, but no sound emerged. His form wavered, becoming more translucent, before solidifying again with visible effort. The anguish in his eyes was unmistakable. "Master Yoda," Luke said, stepping closer to the assembled spirits, "in the old archives, I've found references to something called soul binding. Ancient Sith techniques for ensuring that even death could not free their servants from obligation. Could it be that the Emperor—" "Yes," came a new voice, rich with authority and touched with the accent of Shili. The air shimmered, and Ahsoka Tano materialized beside the other spirits, her head-tail swaying as if in an unfelt breeze. Her presence brought with it memories of the Clone Wars, of battles fought side by side with the man who had been an Anakin Skywalker before his fall. "Ah-so-ka," Luke breathed, recognizing her immediately from his visions. "You know something about this." "I know more than I wish I did," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "During the final days of the Republic, I encountered references to ancient Sith practices in the Jedi archives. Techniques so dark, so abhorrent, that they were sealed away in the deepest vaults. Methods by which a Sith master could bind the soul of his apprentice, ensuring loyalty that extended beyond death itself." She gestured toward an Anakin, whose form continued to flicker unstably. "Your father was not merely Emperor Palpatine's apprentice, Luke. He was his spiritual prisoner, bound by chains forged in the dark side, and strengthened by decades of accumulated guilt and self-hatred. When an Anakin chose love over hate, when he saved you from the Emperor's lightning, his heart was redeemed, but his soul remains shackled." The implications of her words hit Luke like a physical blow. All this time, he had believed his father was at peace, had assumed that an Anakin's final act of sacrifice had earned him the rest he deserved. Instead, the man who had saved the galaxy remained a prisoner in realms beyond mortal understanding. "But there must be a way," Luke said, his voice firm with determination. "The Force doesn't permit injustice to stand forever. If my father is truly redeemed, if his heart turned back to the light in those final moments, then these chains can be broken." Obi-Wan moved closer, his ghostly hand almost touching Luke's shoulder. "The path you speak of is darker and more dangerous than any journey you have yet undertaken. To free Anakin's soul, you would need to venture into the very heart of the Netherworld, to confront not just Palpatine's lingering malice, but the accumulated darkness of 1,000 years of Sith Lords who have used such techniques to enslave the spirits of their followers." "Many there are," Yoda added, his voice barely above a whisper, "who have tried such a thing. Failed, all of them have, lost to the darkness, consumed by the very evil they sought to fight." Luke looked again at his father's struggling spirit, saw the pain that an Anakin could not voice, felt the desperate hope that emanated from his translucent form. In that moment, the choice became clear. "Then I'll be the first to succeed," Luke declared, his words ringing with the confidence of one who had already faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. "I won't abandon him. I won't let the Emperor's evil triumph, not even in death." Ahsoka smiled sadly. "I hoped you would say that. But know this, Luke Skywalker. The journey ahead will test not just your power in the Force, but your very understanding of what it means to be redeemed. You will face truths about your father, about the nature of good and evil, that may shake the foundations of everything you believe." The wind picked up across the swamp, stirring the mists and causing the ancient trees to creak with voices older than civilization. In the distance, the calls of unseen creatures echoed through the twilight, a reminder that Dagobah held secrets yet undiscovered. Luke stood surrounded by the spirits of the greatest Jedi who had ever lived, yet he had never felt more alone. The task before him would require him to venture into realms where even Master Yoda had feared to tread, to challenge powers that had dominated the galaxy for millennia. But as he watched his father's tormented spirit struggle against invisible bonds, Luke Skywalker made a vow that would echo through the Force itself. He would free Anakin's soul, no matter the cost. The greatest battle for redemption was about to begin. The first vision came to Luke 3 nights later, in the depths of meditation beneath Dagobah's triple moons. He had been seeking guidance in the Force, reaching out through the cosmic web that connects all living things, when suddenly the swamp around him dissolved into something far more terrifying. He found himself standing in a vast crystalline chamber that seemed to exist between dimensions. The walls pulsed with a sickly amber light, and suspended in the center of this otherworldly prison was a figure he recognized immediately. An Anakin Skywalker hung motionless, wrapped in chains that appeared to be forged from pure darkness itself. These were not physical bonds, but something far more sinister. They wound around his spirit like living shadows, each link inscribed with Sith runes that burned with malevolent energy. The vision lasted only moments, but when Luke opened his eyes beside the sunken X-wing in Dagobah's murky waters, he was trembling. The image had been so vivid, so undeniably real, that he could still smell the ozone and decay that permeated that spiritual prison. "A glimpse of the Netherworld you have seen," came Yoda's familiar voice. The ancient master's spirit materialized beside Luke, his expression more grave than Luke had ever witnessed. "Difficult to perceive it is for one still bound by flesh, but strong with the Force you have become. See what others cannot, you now can." Luke wiped moisture from his brow, unsure whether it was sweat or the ever-present humidity of the swamp. "Master Yoda, those chains around my father, they weren't like anything I've encountered before. They felt alive, almost sentient. Ancient Sith alchemy, those bonds represent," Yoda explained, settling himself on a moss-covered log with a weary sigh. "Forged not from metal or energy, but from guilt itself, from shame, from self-hatred. The Emperor, cunning beyond measure he was. Your father's darkest emotions, he harvested them into chains unbreakable. He wove them." The full horror of what Yoda described began to dawn on Luke. Palpatine had not simply corrupted an Anakin Skywalker through lies and manipulation. He had performed a kind of spiritual surgery, taking every moment of an Anakin's guilt over his actions and transforming those feelings into literal bonds that would persist beyond death itself. "But surely there must be records of how to break such chains," Luke said, standing and pacing along the water's edge. "The Jedi archives, or the Sith temples I've explored. Someone must have encountered this before." Yoda's ears drooped lower than usual. "Searched the archives. I have. Even before Order 66, rumors there were, whispers of Sith lords who bound the souls of fallen Jedi, who forced the spirits of their enemies to serve in death as they would not in life, but destroyed. Most of those records were, by the Sith themselves, erased from history. They made their darkest secrets. As if summoned by their conversation, the air shimmered, and Obi-Wan Kenobi appeared, his robes rustling in an unfelt breeze. His expression carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "There is one place, Luke, where such records might still exist, but to seek them would require you to venture into territories that no living Jedi has explored for over 1,000 years." "Where?" Luke asked immediately, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "Ah, sus," Obi-Wan replied. "The ancient Jedi world where the Great Sith War reached its climax 10,000 years ago. The archives there were thought completely destroyed, but recent scouting reports suggest that deeper vaults survived, hidden beneath the ruins of the Great Library, sealed away by masters who foresaw dark times ahead." Luke had heard stories of Arsus in his studies of Jedi history. Once the crown jewel of Jedi learning, it had been devastated when the ancient Sith Lord Exar Kun triggered a supernova in an attempt to destroy the planet. The world had survived, barely, but the civilization upon it had been reduced to ash and memory. The journey alone would be perilous. Obi-Wan continued. Arsus lies in regions of space still haunted by the echoes of ancient battles. Force storms rage there, tears in reality itself caused by the massive expenditure of power during the Great Sith War. Ships have been known to disappear entirely, pulled into temporal anomalies or dimensional rifts. But Luke was already making his decision. The vision of his father in chains had seared itself into his memory, and he knew that he would never find peace until an Anakin was free. I have to try. I can't leave him trapped like that. It was then that Ahsoka's spirit manifested, her presence bringing with it the scent of distant worlds and the memories of battles fought in defense of justice. If you're determined to walk this path, Luke, you won't walk it alone. There are others who share your goal, living beings who have their own reasons for wanting to understand the deeper mysteries of the Force. She gestured, and the swamp air rippled like water. Images began to form, showing Luke glimpses of potential allies scattered across the galaxy. He saw a young human male with auburn hair and piercing green eyes, standing amid the wreckage of an Imperial facility on some distant world. This was Cal Kestis, one of the few Jedi to survive. Order 66, now grown to full maturity and carrying his own burden of survivor's guilt. Another image showed a Twi'lek female with pale blue skin and traditional Jedi robes, mediating a dispute between settlers on a frontier world. She radiated calm authority and deep wisdom beyond her apparent years. "That's I la secure Ahsoka," explained. She survived Felucia through means even she doesn't fully understand. The Force itself seemed to shield her at the moment of Order 66's execution. The final image was perhaps the most surprising. It showed a figure in Mandalorian armor, but this warrior moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in the Force. The armor bore the colors of clan Kryze, and even through the helmet's visor, Luke could sense the individual's deep connection to the mystical energy that bound the galaxy together. Each of them has encountered fragments of what you seek to understand. Ahsoka continued, as the images faded. Cal has explored more Imperial archives than perhaps any other Jedi survivor. His experiences with the Zepho temples have given him insights into ancient Force techniques that predate even the Republic. Isla's survival has left her with unique perspectives on the nature of death and resurrection in the Force. And the Mandalorian, well, their people have always had their own relationship with concepts of honor and redemption that transcend death. Luke felt a stirring of hope for the first time since learning of his father's plight. How do I find them? How do I convince them to join such a dangerous quest? Yoda chuckled, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Convince them you will not need to already begun. The Force has to draw together those who must walk this path. Seek them out. You must, but find you. They will also be seeking. Obi-Wan nodded in agreement. The Force works through patterns, Luke. What appears to be coincidence is often destiny unfolding. If you begin your journey to Arsus, I believe you'll find that these allies will reveal themselves when the time is right. As if to underscore his words, a distant rumble echoed across the swamp. Luke looked up to see a sleek starship breaking through Dagobah's perpetual cloud cover, its running lights cutting through the mist like fallen stars. The ship was unfamiliar, but as it settled into a landing pattern near his own vessel, Luke felt a sudden resonance in the Force. Someone was coming who would change everything. The spirits of his mentors began to fade as the ship touched down in the clearing beyond the ancient trees. Remember, Luke, Obi-Wan's voice called as his form dissolved into motes of light. The path to freeing your father's soul will require you to understand not just the nature of Sith binding techniques, but the very essence of what it means to be redeemed. Some chains can only be broken by those who have worn them. Left alone with the approaching footsteps of his mysterious visitor, Luke Skywalker stood at the threshold of a journey that would take him to the very edges of known space and force him to confront truths about the Force that had been hidden for millennia. The call to adventure had sounded, and there could be no turning back. The figure who emerged from the sleek starship was not what Luke had expected. She moved with the precise economical motions of someone trained in combat, but her face carried the serene expression of deep inner peace. Her skin was pale blue, almost luminescent in Dagobah's dim light, and traditional Jedi robes hung gracefully from her slender frame. Most striking of all were her eyes, which held depths of wisdom that seemed impossible for someone who appeared so young. "Master Skywalker," she said, inclining her head in a formal bow. Her voice carried the musical quality typical of Twi'leks, but underneath it was something else, a resonance that spoke of experiences beyond normal comprehension. "I am Ayla Secure. I believe the Force has guided us both to this moment." Luke studied her carefully, extending his senses through the Force. What he discovered was extraordinary. Ayla's presence in the mystical energy field was unlike anything he had encountered before. Where most Force users showed clear patterns of light and shadow, strength and weakness, she seemed to exist in a state of perfect balance. It was as if she had passed through death itself and emerged transformed. "You were supposed to have died on Felucia," Luke said, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. "Commander Blacey's report stated that you fell during Order 66. A sad smile crossed Alayla's features. "I did die on Felucia, in every way that mattered. The woman who trusted her clone troopers implicitly, who believed in the Republic's righteousness, who thought the Jedi Order was eternal. She perished under Bly's blaster fire. But something else awakened in that moment of death. The Force itself reached out and pulled me back from the edge of the Netherworld." She settled onto a moss-covered stone, her movements flowing like water. "In those final seconds, as my body fell and my spirit began its journey beyond, I caught a glimpse of something that has haunted me ever since. A realm of shadows and chains, where souls writhe in torment, despite having found redemption in their final moments. I saw your father there, Luke, bound by darkness that seemed to feed on his own remorse." Luke felt his breath catch. Here was confirmation of his visions, validation that what he had seen was not merely the product of his own fears and hopes. "You've seen the Netherworld directly." "More than seen it," Ayla replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've walked its borders. During the years since Order 66, I've discovered that my resurrection left me with abilities that no Jedi text describes. I can perceive the boundaries between life and death, can sense the spiritual chains that bind tormented souls to realms of suffering." She gestured toward the swamp around them, and Luke suddenly became aware of presences he had never noticed before. Faint, ghostly figures moved between the trees, the spirits of creatures and beings who had died on Dagobah over the centuries. But these were not the peaceful Force ghosts of redeemed Jedi. These were something else entirely, souls caught in states of unrest, unable to move on to whatever waited beyond. "Every world touched by significant violence carries such echoes," Tyler explained, noticing his growing awareness, "but they're usually invisible to the living, locked away behind barriers that the Force maintains to protect us from madness. My death and resurrection tore holes in those barriers. I see them always now, the unquiet dead who cannot find peace." Luke understood immediately why the Force had guided Ayla to him. Her unique experiences made her perhaps the only living person who might be able to navigate the spiritual realms where his father's soul was imprisoned. But he also sensed the tremendous burden her abilities represented. To constantly perceive the suffering of the dead would be a torment beyond imagination. "There's something else you should know," Alila continued, rising from her seat and moving to stand beside Luke at the water's edge. "I'm not the only one who has been drawn into this mystery. 3 days ago, I received a transmission on channels that should have been impossible to access. It came from Cal Kestis." Luke recognized the name from Ahsoka's vision. But before he could speak, Isla was activating a small holoprojector she had withdrawn from her robes. The device flickered to life, showing the image of the young man Luke had seen in the Force-induced visions. Cal appeared to be standing in what looked like an ancient archive, surrounded by towering shelves filled with holocrons and bound volumes. "If you're receiving this message," Cal's recorded voice said, "then the Force has identified you as someone connected to the mystery I've been investigating. My name is Cal Kestis, and I've spent the last 5 years exploring Imperial facilities and ancient temples across the Outer Rim. What I've discovered will shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about the relationship between the Jedi and Sith." The hologram showed Cal moving deeper into the archive, past texts that looked older than the Republic itself. "On Dathomir, in the deepest vaults beneath the Night Sister Fortress, I found records that predate the formation of the Jedi Order. They describe techniques used by the earliest Force users, methods for binding souls that were considered too dangerous even for the ancient Sith to employ regularly." Cal paused before a massive tome, bound in what appeared to be scales from some extinct creature. "But more importantly, I found references to counter techniques, ways to break spiritual bonds that were developed by a sect of Force users who called themselves the Wills. They believed that no soul, no matter how corrupted, should be denied the possibility of redemption and peace." The implications of Cal's words hit Luke like a physical blow. The Wills were legendary figures in the most ancient Jedi teachings, beings who were said to understand the Force more deeply than any other sentience in galactic history. If they had developed methods for breaking soul bonds, then there might truly be hope for freeing his father. "I'm heading to Arsuz now," Cal's message continued. "The coordinates attached to this transmission will lead you to a rendezvous point in the Adigan system. But be warned, I'm not the only one who has discovered these secrets. Imperial remnant forces have been systematically hunting down anyone with knowledge of soul-binding techniques. They're being led by someone who calls himself the Keeper of Souls, and his methods are unlike anything the Empire ever employed." The hologram flickered and died, leaving Luke and Isla standing in the growing darkness of Dagobah's evening. In the distance, nocturnal creatures had begun their haunting calls, adding an otherworldly quality to the already mystical atmosphere. "A Keeper of Souls," Luke mused, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the humid night air. "That suggests there are others who understand these techniques, others who might be using them for their own purposes." Adela nodded grimly. "And if Cal is right about this threat, then our mission to free your father may be more urgent than we realized. Someone else is actively working to ensure that bound souls remain in their spiritual prisons." Luke looked up at the stars beginning to appear through Dagobah's perpetual cloud cover. Somewhere out there, his father's spirit remained trapped in chains of guilt and darkness. But now he had allies, others who shared his determination to right this cosmic injustice. The journey to Arsus would be perilous, filled with dangers both physical and spiritual, but for the first time since learning of an Arkin's plight, Luke felt genuine hope. "When do we leave?" he asked. Atela smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "The Force has waited decades for this moment. Luke Skywalker, I think it's time we stopped keeping it waiting." The journey to the Adigan system took 3 days aboard Ayla's ship, a modified consular-class cruiser she had named Serenity's Edge. The vessel bore scars from numerous encounters with Imperial remnants, but its modifications were extraordinary. The ship's meditation chambers had been enhanced with crystals that amplified force sensitivity, allowing its occupants to perceive spiritual phenomena with unprecedented clarity. It was during the second day of hyperspace travel that Luke experienced his most vivid vision yet. He had been meditating in the ship's central chamber when suddenly the familiar blue tunnel of hyperspace dissolved around him, replaced by something far more disturbing. He found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast underground complex, its walls covered in hieroglyphs that hurt to look at directly. The air was thick with the oppressive weight of accumulated darkness, and in the center of the chamber stood a figure that made Luke's blood run cold. Emperor Palpatine, or something wearing his form, turned slowly to face Luke. But this was not the decrepit old man who had fallen to his death aboard the Death Star. This version of the Emperor appeared as he might have in his prime, his face unmarked by the ravages of the dark side, his yellow eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. "Young Skywalker," the apparition spoke, its voice echoing with unnatural resonance. "How persistent you are, just like your father was before I taught him the futility of hope." Luke tried to speak, tried to move, but found himself frozen in place by some invisible force. The Emperor began to circle him, his feet making no sound on the stone floor. "You think to free Anakin's soul, don't you?" Palpatine continued, his lips curling into a smile that was more terrifying than any expression of rage. "You believe that love conquers all, that redemption can break any chain. How wonderfully naive." The Emperor gestured, and the walls of the chamber became transparent, revealing countless other chambers stretching away into infinity. In each one, Luke could see figures suspended in crystalline prisons, their faces twisted in expressions of eternal anguish. Some he recognized from his studies of Jedi history, others were complete strangers, but all shared the same look of hopeless despair. "Behold my true empire," Palpatine whispered, his voice now coming from everywhere at once. "Death was never my enemy, boy. Death was my greatest ally. Every soul I have claimed, every spirit I have bound, adds to my power in the realm beyond flesh. Your father was merely the crown jewel in a collection that spans millennia." Luke struggled against the invisible bonds holding him, channeling his anger into strength, but the Emperor only laughed. "Yes, feel your hatred. Let it flow through you. Do you know what the most delicious irony is, young Jedi? Every attempt to free a bound soul only strengthens the chains. The guilt that your father feels over his crimes, the self-loathing that allows me to maintain my hold on him, those emotions are fed by the knowledge that his son suffers on his behalf." The vision began to fade, but not before Palpatine delivered one final chilling message. "Come to Arsus if you dare. Come and add your own soul to my collection." Luke gasped, opening his eyes to find himself back in the meditation chamber aboard Serenity's Edge. Isla was kneeling beside him, her expression filled with concern and something else that might have been fear. "The darkness touched you," she said, her voice tight with worry. "I felt it through the ship's entire superstructure. What did you see?" Luke described his vision in detail, watching Ayla's expression grow more troubled with each word. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her head bowed in thought. "What you've seen confirms my worst fears," she finally said. "The Keeper of Souls that Cal mentioned in his message. I believe it may be more than just an Imperial remnant leader. If Palpatine found a way to extend his influence beyond death, if he's been collecting bound souls for centuries or even millennia, then we're not just trying to free your father. We're potentially facing a threat that could consume the spiritual essence of the entire galaxy." Before Luke could respond, the ship's comm system crackled to life. Cal Kestis's voice filled the chamber. but there was an urgency to it that hadn't been present in his recorded message. Any ships receiving this transmission, please respond immediately. This is Cal Kestis, broadcasting from the ASUS system. I've made contact with the ancient archives, but the situation here is far worse than I anticipated. The entire planet is crawling with Imperial remnant forces, and they're not just searching for artifacts, they're conducting some kind of ritual in the ruins of the great Jedi library. Luke rushed to the ship's cockpit, Isla close behind him. The hyperdrive controls showed they were still 12 hours out from their destination, but Cal's message was coming through with perfect clarity. I've managed to access some of the deeper vaults, Cal continued, his voice occasionally interrupted by what sounded like blaster fire in the background. What I've found here defies everything we thought we knew about the Force. The Wills weren't just ancient Force users, they were guardians of the boundary between life and death itself. They developed techniques for soul liberation not out of compassion, but out of necessity. They were fighting a war against entities that fed on spiritual suffering. The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving Luke and Isla staring at the comm unit in growing alarm. Luke was already reaching for the hyperdrive controls when Isla caught his arm. "Wait," she said, her eyes closed in concentration. "I'm sensing something else, another presence approaching our location." Through the cockpit's viewports, they could see nothing but the swirling blue of hyperspace, but Luke extended his senses, feeling for whatever Ayla had detected. After a moment he found it, a familiar presence that made his heart race with hope. "Ah, Sokar," he breathed. As if responding to his words, the space directly in front of their ship began to ripple and distort. A sleek vessel emerged from what appeared to be empty hyperspace, a ship Luke had never seen before, but which radiated a sense of ancient power. "Luke," came Sokar's voice over the comm. "We need to talk. I've discovered something about your father's condition that changes everything." The ship that had materialized was unlike anything in current galactic ship design. It was clearly of ancient origin, its hull covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. As it moved into formation beside Serenity's edge, Luke could feel emanations of Force energy that were almost overwhelming in their intensity. "I've been traveling the unknown regions," Sokar's voice continued, "following rumors of a world where the ancient Wills once maintained their primary temple. What I found there has convinced me that the situation on Arsus is a trap, Luke. The Keeper of Souls isn't just some Imperial remnant leader, he's something far older, something that has been manipulating galactic events for thousands of years." Luke felt a chill run down his spine. If Sokar was right, if they were walking into a carefully laid trap, then their mission to free his father's soul might instead result in their own spiritual enslavement. "But there's hope," Sokar added, her voice carrying a note of determined optimism that Luke remembered from the stories of the Clone Wars. The Wills left behind more than just techniques for breaking soul bonds. They left behind weapons, artifacts specifically designed to combat spiritual parasites and entities that exist in the space between life and death. If we're going to face this Keeper of Souls, we'll need every advantage we can gather. As the two ships traveled through hyperspace in formation, Luke found himself reflecting on how quickly their mission had evolved. What had begun as a quest to understand his father's spiritual condition had become something far greater and more dangerous. They were potentially facing an entity that had been collecting souls for millennia, that might have influenced the rise and fall of entire civilizations. But looking at Ailey's determined expression, feeling Sokar's unwavering resolve through their connection in the Force, Luke realized that they had also gathered allies whose combined abilities might be sufficient for the task ahead. The true nature of their enemy was becoming clearer, and with that clarity came the knowledge they would need to fight back. The journey to Arsus would be more than just a fact-finding mission now. It would be the opening battle in a war for the very souls of the galaxy. The three ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sus system, and what Luke saw through the viewport made his stomach clench with dread. The ancient Jedi world hung before them like a wounded giant, its surface scarred by canyons that stretched across entire continents. These were not natural formations, but the aftermath of the Great Sith War, wounds carved into the planet's crust when XR Kun supernovas had torn through local space 10 millennia ago. But it was what surrounded the planet that truly alarmed Luke. Imperial Star Destroyers, at least a dozen of them, maintained orbital positions around Sus. Their hulls bore markings he didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when observed directly. These weren't standard Imperial remnant forces, they were something else entirely. "Those aren't normal ships," Isla whispered from beside him, her enhanced perception of spiritual energies clearly picking up something disturbing. "The darkness emanating from those vessels is unlike anything I've encountered. It's as if they're powered by suffering itself." Ahsoka's voice crackled over the comm from her ancient vessel. "The symbols on their hulls are written in the script of the Ra-Kar-Ta, the infinite empire that ruled the galaxy 30,000 years ago. But they've been corrupted, twisted into something that hurts the Force itself to perceive." Luke studied the fleet through his ship's sensors, noting the way space itself seemed to bend around the vessels. Reality appeared unstable in their vicinity, as if the very laws of physics were being rewritten by whatever power source they employed. "There," Alila pointed to a break in the orbital formation. "Call's ship. I can sense his presence. He's alive, but barely. Something has happened to him, down on the surface." They managed to slip through the Imperial cordon by following one of the ancient hyperspace routes that the Jedi had used during their occupation of Sus. Ahsoka's ship led the way, its mysterious technology somehow rendering all three vessels invisible to the enemy sensors. But as they descended through the planet's atmosphere, Luke began to understand the true scope of what they faced. The ruins of the Great Jedi Library stretched across the horizon, a city-sized complex that had once housed the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of Jedi learning. Most of it lay in rubble, but massive sections remained standing, their walls covered in the same shifting symbols that adorned the Imperial ships above. By the Force, Luke breathed, recognizing the implications immediately. They're not just searching the archives, they're converting them. Every standing structure had been transformed into some kind of ritual site. Massive crystalline formations had been erected throughout the ruins, each one pulsing with the same sickly amber light Luke had seen in his visions of the Netherworld. Between the crystals, robed figures moved in precise patterns, their chanting audible even through the ship's hulls. They found Cal's vessel crashed in a canyon several kilometers from the main ruins, its hull blackened by energy weapon impacts. The young Jedi was alive but unconscious, his body bearing the distinctive marks of Force lightning. Alayla worked to revive him while Luke and Ahsoka established a perimeter, but the planet's oppressive atmosphere made concentration difficult. When Cal finally opened his eyes, his first words sent chills through the entire group. "It's not Palpatine," he gasped, struggling to sit up despite his injuries. "The Keeper of Souls, he's not the Emperor. He's something much older, much worse. I found records in the deepest vaults, texts that predate the formation of the Republic itself. This entity has been manipulating galactic history for over 25,000 years." Luke knelt beside his wounded ally, offering what healing he could through the Force. "What did you discover down there? What are those crystals, and why are they converting the library ruins?" Cal's eyes held the haunted look of someone who had gazed too deeply into cosmic horror. "The crystals are soul prisons, Luke. Each one can hold thousands of spirits in eternal torment. The Keeper isn't just trying to bind individual souls like your father. He's preparing to capture the spiritual essence of everyone who dies throughout the galaxy. Kyla's face went pale. A harvest on that scale would require incredible amounts of power to initiate. The kind of power that could only come from the cosmic force itself. Cal finished grimly. He's found a way to tap directly into the source of all force energy. If he succeeds, if he manages to complete whatever ritual he's conducting in the library ruins, then every soul that passes into death will automatically be drawn into his collection. The implications were staggering. Luke thought of the billions of beings throughout the galaxy, all potentially facing eternal imprisonment upon their deaths. The natural cycle of the Force, the peaceful transition from life into unity with the cosmic force, would be perverted into an engine of perpetual suffering. But there's more, Cal continued, his voice growing stronger as Luke's healing energies worked through his system. I found references to counter-rituals, techniques developed by the ancient wills to combat exactly this type of spiritual parasitism. The problem is that the rituals require willing sacrifice from force-sensitive individuals. Someone has to voluntarily enter the Netherworld and confront the Keeper directly. Ahsoka, who had been silent throughout Cal's explanation, finally spoke. The wills didn't develop those techniques out of theoretical interest. They were fighting a war, weren't they? The same war we're now being drawn into. Cal nodded weakly. The entity we're facing was known to the ancients as the Soul Render. He's not truly alive in any sense we understand, but he's not dead either. He exists in the spaces between dimensions, feeding on spiritual energy and growing stronger with each soul he claims. The wills managed to defeat him once, but it cost them everything. Their entire civilization was consumed in the effort. Luke stood pacing to the edge of their makeshift shelter as he processed this information. Through the Force, he could sense the massive ritual taking place in the ruins of the great library. The chanting of the robed figures had grown louder, more urgent, and the amber crystals were pulsing in perfect synchronization. "How long do we have?" he asked. "According to the texts I translated, the ritual reaches its culmination during the next galactic alignment," Cal replied. "When the core worlds, the deep core, and the unknown regions achieve perfect astronomical symmetry, that gives us perhaps 6 standard days. 6 days to prevent the spiritual enslavement of every soul in the galaxy." The magnitude of the task seemed impossible, but Luke found himself thinking of his father's face in the vision, the desperate hope in Anakin's eyes as he struggled against his invisible chains. "Then we need to understand exactly what the wills did to stop him before," Luke decided. "If they found a way to defeat this Soul Render once, their methods might work again." Isla moved to the shelter's entrance, her enhanced senses monitoring the spiritual energies swirling around them. "The problem is that using their techniques would likely require the same sacrifice they made. The wills didn't just defeat the Soul Render. They completely removed themselves from the physical plane of existence. They became something else, something that exists purely in the cosmic force." The weight of what she was suggesting settled over the group like a shroud. To save the galaxy, they might have to give up their very existence, transforming themselves into beings of pure spiritual energy, with no possibility of return to mortal life. But as Luke looked at his companions, saw the determination in their faces, despite the terrible cost they might have to pay, he realized that they had already made their choice. The Soul Render had made one critical miscalculation in his millennia-long plan. He had underestimated the power of beings willing to sacrifice everything for others, the strength that came from love, transcending even death itself. The battle for every soul in the galaxy was about to begin, and Luke Skywalker intended to win it, no matter what the price might be. That night, as the amber crystals continued their ominous pulsing across the ruined landscape, Luke found himself drawn into the deepest meditation of his life. The others slept fitfully around the small campfire they had built in the shelter of a collapsed archive wall, but sleep eluded him entirely. The Force itself seemed to be calling to him, guiding his consciousness toward revelations that would reshape his understanding of the galaxy's hidden history. In his meditative trance, Luke felt his awareness expand beyond his physical form, drifting through layers of time and space, until he found himself standing in the ruins of Sus, as they had existed 10,000 years ago. But this was not the devastated world he knew. This was Sus in its glory, when the great Jedi library had been a beacon of learning that drew scholars from across the known galaxy. The vision was more vivid than any he had previously experienced. He could smell the mountain air, feel the warmth of the planet's twin suns on his skin, hear the distant hum of speeder traffic as students and masters moved between the towering spires of knowledge. But gradually, he became aware of a shadow growing at the edges of this peaceful scene. The shadow had a name, though it was spoken in whispers even in this ancient time: Soul Render. The entity that existed between dimensions, that fed on spiritual suffering and grew stronger with each corrupted soul it claimed. Luke watched as the Jedi Masters of that era gathered in emergency council, their faces grave with the knowledge of approaching cosmic horror. The ancient enemy stirs once more, one of the Masters was saying, his voice echoing with the authority of centuries. Our archives contain references dating back to the formation of the Jedi Order itself. This Soul Render has attempted the Great Harvest 4 times in galactic history, and each time the cost of stopping him has been almost beyond bearing. Luke found himself able to move through this vision as if he were truly present, walking among the greatest Jedi who had ever lived. He approached the speaker, recognizing him from ancient holo-records as Master Dan the Drathos scholar who had helped establish the library itself. Master, Luke found himself saying, though he wasn't sure if his voice could be heard in this echo of the past, "Tell me about the Wills. Tell me how they stopped him before." To his amazement, Dan turned directly toward him, his ancient eyes focusing on Luke with startling clarity. "Young one from the far future, your presence here is no accident. The Force itself has allowed you to witness these events because the knowledge you seek will be crucial to your own struggle." The scene around them shifted, and suddenly they were standing in a vast chamber filled with beings unlike any Luke had ever seen. The Wills were tall, ethereal creatures whose forms seemed to exist partially in several dimensions simultaneously. Their faces bore expressions of profound wisdom tinged with infinite sadness, as if they carried the weight of cosmic responsibility. "The Soul Render cannot be defeated through conventional means," Dan continued, his voice now speaking directly into Luke's mind. "He exists in the spaces between life and death, drawing power from the very foundations of the Force itself. To stop him requires beings willing to enter his realm and confront him on his own terms." Luke watched as the Wills prepared for their ultimate sacrifice. They were not going to battle in the traditional sense, but rather transforming themselves into something else entirely. Through ancient rituals whose complexity defied comprehension, they were becoming living conduits for the pure essence of the cosmic force, beings who could exist in the Netherworld without being corrupted by its darkness. "But the cost," Luke whispered, understanding beginning to dawn on him. "The cost was everything," Dan replied sadly. "They gave up their individual existence, their memories, their connections to the physical universe. They became part of the Force itself, eternal guardians, standing watch at the boundaries between dimensions. And when they confronted the Soul Render, they didn't destroy him. They bound him, locked him away in the deepest layers of the Netherworld where he could not reach the souls of the living." The vision began to shift again, showing Luke glimpses of the battle itself. In the space between dimensions, beings of pure light confronted an entity of absolute darkness. The Soul Render appeared as a massive shadow-given form, tentacles of spiritual darkness reaching out to ensnare the Wills as they fought to contain him. The binding held for 25,000 years. Dan-Er's voice continued as the cosmic battle raged before them. But bindings can be broken, especially when someone with sufficient knowledge and power seeks to do so deliberately. Luke felt a chill of understanding. Someone released him, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Yes, someone who sought to use the Soul Render's power for their own purposes, someone who believed they could control an entity that had existed since before the first civilizations learned to use the Force. The vision shifted one final time, showing Luke a familiar figure standing before a massive crystalline structure buried deep beneath the surface of an unknown world. Emperor Palpatine, but not as Luke had ever seen him. This was Palpatine in his prime, decades before he became Emperor, his face unmarked by the ravages of the dark side. In his hands, he held an ancient artifact that pulsed with malevolent energy. The young Sith Lord found the Soul Render's prison during his early explorations of the unknown regions, Dan-Er explained. He believed he could forge an alliance with the entity, use its power to achieve immortality and dominion over death itself. Instead, he became its pawn, his entire rise to power orchestrated to serve the Soul Render's need for a massive harvest of souls. Luke watched in horror as the young Palpatine shattered the crystalline bindings, releasing tendrils of absolute darkness that immediately began to corrupt everything they touched. The Emperor believed he was seizing power, but in reality, he was being consumed by it. Every act of the Empire, every atrocity committed in the name of order, every soul destroyed by imperial cruelty, all of it fed the Soul Render's growing strength. Dan-Er continued. The Death Star was not merely a weapon of terror, it was a tool for mass spiritual harvest. Each world it destroyed provided the entity with millions of souls torn violently from life. The implications staggered Luke. The entire galactic civil war, his father's fall to the dark side, the deaths of billions of innocent beings, all of it had been orchestrated by an entity whose existence predated recorded history. The struggle between the Empire and the Rebellion had been nothing more than a feeding mechanism for cosmic horror. But my father, Luke said desperately, his redemption, his choice to save me, surely that meant something. Dan-Er's expression softened with something approaching hope. Your father's redemption was real, young Skywalker, and it was the first crack in the Soul Render's carefully laid plans. When an Anakin chose love over hate, when he sacrificed himself to save his son, he proved that even the most thoroughly corrupted soul could still choose the light. The entity had counted on Vader's spiritual enslavement being permanent, but love transcended even cosmic manipulation. The vision began to fade, but not before Dan-Er delivered one final, crucial piece of information. The Soul Render grows desperate now. The ritual he conducts on Sus is his final gambit, his attempt to harvest every soul in the galaxy before heroes like you can organize effective resistance. But desperation makes even cosmic entities vulnerable to mistakes. He has revealed himself too early, shown his hand before his preparations are complete. As Luke's consciousness returned to his physical body beside the dying campfire, he found Isla watching him with concern. The Twi'lek's enhanced sensitivity had clearly detected the power of the vision he had just experienced. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she asked quietly. "The true enemy we face." Luke nodded, his mind still reeling from the revelations. "We're not just fighting to free my father's soul, we're fighting to prevent the spiritual enslavement of every being in the galaxy. And the only way to stop it may require us to give up everything we are." Ayla smiled sadly, her expression reflecting the same infinite sadness Luke had seen in the faces of the ancient wills. Sometimes the greatest victories require the greatest sacrifices, but at least now we understand what we're truly fighting for. In the distance, the amber crystals pulsed brighter, their rhythm growing more urgent as the Soul Render's ritual approached its culmination. Time was running out, but for the first time since learning of the cosmic threat they faced, Luke felt genuine hope. The ancient wills had shown him the way forward, even if that path led through transformation beyond imagining. Dawn broke over Arsus with an unnatural quality, the light filtering through atmosphere that had been poisoned by the Soul Render's presence. The twin suns rose blood-red over the horizon, their radiance dimmed by spiritual pollution that made even breathing feel labored. Luke woke to find that Cal had recovered enough strength to move, though the young Jedi's face still bore the pallor of someone who had gazed too deeply into cosmic horror. "There's something else," Cal said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge that had been burning inside him through the long night. "In the deepest vaults beneath the library, I found records that the Soul Render isn't working alone. He has servants, beings who were once like us but who chose to surrender their humanity in exchange for power over death itself." Ahsoka, who had been monitoring the Imperial forces through her ship's advanced sensors, looked up sharply. The robed figures conducting the ritual. "You think they're not just Imperial cultists?" Cal shook his head grimly. "They're Sith Lords, but not as we understand the term. These are beings who transcended death through corruption rather than redemption. They exist in a state between life and death, forever bound to the Soul Render's will. Some of their names appear in texts dating back to the earliest days of the Sith Order itself." Luke felt his blood chill as the implications became clear. If ancient Sith Lords were serving the Soul Render directly, then their mission had become infinitely more dangerous. These weren't merely dark side adepts, but beings who had maintained their consciousness through millennia of spiritual corruption. "How many?" Isla asked, her enhanced perceptions already reaching out toward the ritual sites in the distance. "I identified at least 7 distinct entities," Cal replied, consulting notes he had scrawled on a piece of damaged datapad during his escape from the library ruins. "Markar Ragnos, the ancient Sith king whose tomb we disturbed on Kor Ifban. Freedon Nad, whose spirit corrupted an entire planet for centuries. Arjun Tarpal, the first Dark Lord of the Sith, and others whose names are lost to history, but whose spiritual signatures reek of accumulated malevolence." Luke closed his eyes, extending his senses toward the ritual sites, as Ayla was doing. What he felt there made his stomach clench with revulsion. The dark side energy wasn't merely strong, it was concentrated to an almost physical density. These weren't Force ghosts as he understood them, but something far more substantial and infinitely more dangerous. "They're feeding the Soul Render their accumulated power," he realized aloud. "Every atrocity they committed in life, every soul they corrupted, every act of cruelty that strengthened their connection to the dark side, all of it is being channeled into his ritual." Ahsoka nodded gravely. "Which means that even if we could somehow disrupt the ceremony, we'd still have to face beings whose power has been growing unchecked for thousands of years. And unlike living Sith Lords, these entities can't be killed in any conventional sense." The group fell silent as the magnitude of their task became fully apparent. They were not just facing a cosmic entity of unimaginable power, but an entire army of undead Sith Lords whose combined malevolence had been accumulating for millennia. The odds seemed impossible, beyond hopeless. It was then that the Force itself seemed to respond to their despair. The air around their shelter began to shimmer, and new presences made themselves known. But these were not the oppressive darkness of the Sith spirits. These were beings of light, ancient Jedi, whose wisdom transcended even death. Master Odan-Ur appeared first, his ethereal form radiating the calm authority that had made him legendary even in his own time. Beside him materialized other figures from Jedi history, masters whose names were spoken with reverence in the most sacred texts. Nomi Sunreader, who had led the Jedi through their darkest hour during the Great Sith War. Like Keldroma, the fallen Jedi, who had found redemption in sacrifice. Even Ray-Van appeared, his presence carrying the unique balance of one who had walked both sides of the Force and emerged stronger for the experience. The balance shifts, Damn said, his voice echoing with harmonics that seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions. For every servant of darkness that the Soul Render has claimed, the Force has preserved those who chose light over shadow, redemption over corruption. Luke felt his heart lift as he understood what the ancient master was telling them. They were not alone in this battle. The accumulated wisdom and power of every Jedi who had ever chosen sacrifice over self-interest was available to them, if they could find the courage to accept the cost. But the living must lead, Nomi Sunreader added, her presence bringing with it memories of battles fought against impossible odds. We who have passed beyond can offer guidance, can lend you our strength, but the final confrontation must be faced by those who still draw breath. Only the living can make the choice that the ancient wills made, the transformation that will allow you to face the Soul Render in his own realm. Refu-Van stepped forward, his form more solid than the others, as if his experience with both light and dark had given him a unique connection to the physical world. There is another way, he said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had faced cosmic threats before. The wills sacrificed their individual existence to become one with the cosmic force, but they were operating from incomplete understanding. They believed that confronting the Soul Render required complete dissolution of the self. Luke leaned forward, sensing that Rev-Van's words might hold the key to saving both the galaxy and themselves. What did they miss? Love, Ray-Van replied simply. The connections between souls that transcend even death itself. The wills were solitary beings, scholars and philosophers who understood the Force intellectually, but had never experienced the bonds that tie one consciousness to another through acts of sacrifice and redemption. As if to underscore his words, another presence made itself known. This one was different from the ancient Jedi Masters, carrying with it a warmth and familiarity that made Luke's heart race. Qui-Gon Jinn materialized beside the others, his gentle smile unchanged by his journey beyond death. Your father's love for you, Luke, created a connection that not even the Soul Render's chains could completely sever, Qui-Gon said, his voice carrying the same patient wisdom that had guided a young Obi-Wan through his trials. That connection is what allows an Anakin spirit to maintain some degree of consciousness even while bound. And it may be the key to not just freeing him, but to defeating the Soul Render without requiring complete self-sacrifice. Cal, who had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement, suddenly grabbed his damaged datapad. The texts I found, there were references to something called the Chain of Sacrifice, not individual transformation, but linked consciousness, souls bound together by love rather than corruption. Alayla's eyes widened as understanding dawned, a network of redeemed souls, each one anchoring the others to their individual identity, even while they merge with the cosmic force. It would allow us to enter the Netherworld while maintaining enough personal identity to return, but it would still require tremendous sacrifice. Ahsoka warned, though her voice carried a note of growing hope. To create such a chain, each participant would need to be willing to risk everything for the others. The bonds would have to be forged in absolute trust and unconditional love. Luke looked around at his companions, these beings who had already proven their willingness to face impossible odds for the sake of others. Cal, who had survived Order 66 and dedicated his life to preserving Jedi knowledge. Ayla, who had transcended death itself and chosen to return to help the living. Ahsoka, whose loyalty had survived even the fall of the Jedi Order. And in the space between dimensions, he could sense his father's presence, Anakin's spirit straining against its bonds with desperate hope that his son might somehow find a way to break the chains that held not just him, but millions of other suffering souls. "Then we forge the chain," Luke decided, his voice carrying the certainty of destiny fulfilled. "We create bonds of love, strong enough to withstand even cosmic darkness. And we go into the Netherworld not as individuals seeking to sacrifice ourselves, but as a family determined to bring our lost brother home." The ancient Jedi Masters smiled as one, their forms beginning to fade as the morning light grew stronger. But their final words carried the weight of prophecy itself. "The Force awaits your choice, children of light. Choose well, for the fate of every soul in the galaxy rests upon the strength of the love you bear for one another." The preparation for forging the chain of sacrifice required them to venture deeper into the ruins of Arsus than any living being had traveled since the Great Sith War. Cal led them through collapsed corridors and past chambers filled with the crystallized remains of ancient scholars, their forms preserved in the moment of the cataclysm that had nearly destroyed the planet. But it was what they discovered in the deepest vault that would change everything they thought they understood about the nature of the Force itself. The chamber was vast, carved from the living bedrock of the planet and reinforced with materials that predated even the earliest Republic technologies. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, not because of their darkness, but because of their overwhelming complexity. These were not Sith hieroglyphs or ancient Jedi script, but something far older, a written language that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "These are celestial inscriptions." "Ah," Sokar whispered, her voice filled with awe and trepidation. "The architects who built Centerpoint Station, who created the Moore installation, who shaped entire star systems according to their will. This chamber predates anything we've encountered by hundreds of thousands of years." At the center of the room stood a massive crystalline structure, but unlike the Amber Soul prisons the Soul Render had created throughout the ruins, this one pulsed with pure, clean light. Within its translucent depths, Luke could see moving figures, beings of incredible beauty and power, who seemed to exist in a state of perpetual meditation. "The wills," Cal breathed, his enhanced connection to ancient Force techniques, allowing him to perceive what the others could not. "They didn't disappear when they bound the Soul Render. They've been here all along, maintaining a prison that exists outside of normal space and time." As if responding to their presence, the crystal began to resonate with harmonics that spoke directly to their souls rather than their ears. The figures within became clearer, and Luke realized he was looking at beings who had transcended individual existence while somehow maintaining their essential nature. One of the wills turned toward them, and when it spoke, its voice carried the accumulated wisdom of eons. "Children of the later age, you arrive at the moment of greatest peril. The Soul Render stirs in his bonds fed by the dark rituals above. Soon he will have strength enough to shatter even our prison and complete the great harvest he has sought for so long." Luke stepped closer to the crystal, feeling the power radiating from within. "We know about the chain of sacrifice. We understand that love can create bonds strong enough to enter the Netherworld without losing ourselves completely. But there's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told us about the true nature of what we face." The will's expression, alien though it was, conveyed profound sadness. "The Soul Render is not merely an entity that feeds on spiritual suffering. He is a wound in the Force itself, a scar left by the first act of cosmic evil ever committed. When the universe was young, and the Force flowed pure and undivided, there came a moment when conscious beings first chose selfishness over compassion, hatred over love. The chamber around them began to shift and change, the walls becoming transparent to reveal visions of the galaxy's earliest history. Luke saw star systems being born from cosmic dust, watched as the first Force-sensitive species emerged from primordial worlds, and began to explore the mystical energy that connected all living things. The Force is not merely a tool or source of power, the will continued, its voice now coming from everywhere at once. It is the living consciousness of the universe itself, the sum total of all life, all love, all sacrifice, and all hope. But for consciousness to exist, there must be the possibility of choice, and choice inevitably includes the option to choose wrongly. Luke watched in fascination and growing horror as the visions showed him the first great civilizations to master the Force, the Rakata, with their infinite empire built on conquest and slavery. The Qua, who created dimensional gateways that tore holes in reality itself. Ancient species whose names were lost to history, but whose choices had scarred the fabric of existence. Each act of cosmic evil, each choice to place selfish desire above the well-being of others, created small wounds in the Force, the will explained. And over millions of years, those wounds began to coalesce, to develop a kind of malevolent consciousness of their own. The Soul Render is not a being that was corrupted by the dark side. He is the dark side given form, the living embodiment of every cruel choice ever made. The Talida gasped as understanding dawned. That's why conventional weapons and Force techniques can't destroy him permanently. He's not separate from the Force, he's part of it. Destroying him would require destroying the capacity for evil itself, which would also eliminate free will. Precisely, the will confirmed. This is why we chose imprisonment over destruction. The Soul Render cannot be eliminated without fundamentally altering the nature of existence itself. But he can be contained, his influence limited, his power channeled away from the innocent. Cal, who had been studying the inscriptions on the chamber walls, suddenly looked up with excitement and terror warring in his expression. But there's another option, isn't there? These symbols, they're not just describing the Soul Render's nature, they're outlining a way to transform him. The will turned its attention to the young Jedi with something approaching approval. You see clearly, child of knowledge, the Soul Render is what he is, because he has never experienced genuine love, never known the joy of selfless sacrifice. He is the aggregate of all selfish choices, but he has no understanding of what selflessness truly means. Luke felt his heart begin to race as the implications became clear. You're saying we could redeem him, actually redeem the living embodiment of cosmic evil. It would require someone willing to offer themselves not as sacrifice, but as teacher, the will replied. Someone who has experienced both the darkness of selfish choice and the light of redemptive love. Someone who understands intimately how a soul can be transformed from shadow to light. The chamber fell silent as all eyes turned to Luke, but it was Ahsoka who voiced what they were all thinking. Your father, Anakin's journey from light to darkness and back to light again. His unique understanding of both corruption and redemption. It makes him the only being in the galaxy who could reach the Soul Render. Luke felt a chill run through him as he understood what was being suggested. But Anakin is bound by the Soul Render's own chains. He can't reach out to anyone while he's imprisoned in spiritual bonds forged from his own guilt and shame. Which is why the chain of sacrifice becomes crucial, the will explained. If you and your companions can forge bonds of love strong enough to sustain you in the Netherworld, you can reach Anakin's imprisoned spirit and free him from his chains. And once he is free, he becomes capable of offering the Soul Render something it has never experienced. Genuine understanding and compassion from someone who has walked the same dark path. The magnitude of what they were attempting began to sink in. They weren't just trying to free Anakin's soul or prevent the great harvest. They were attempting something that had never been tried in the history of the galaxy, the redemption of cosmic evil itself. But what if it doesn't work? Cal asked, voicing the fear that was growing in all their hearts. What if the Soul Render is too far gone, too consumed by accumulated malevolence to accept redemption? What if offering him compassion only makes him stronger? The will's response carried the weight of infinite sadness. Then the universe will have learned something profound about the nature of evil and the limits of redemption. But until the attempt is made, until love is offered freely, even to the most undeserving, we cannot know the true boundaries of the Force's power to heal. Luke looked around at his companions, seeing his own determination reflected in their faces. They had come here to save one soul, his father's spirit trapped in chains of guilt and shame. But the Force had revealed to them a path to something far greater, the healing of a wound that had been festering in the heart of existence itself for millions of years. Then we forge the chain, Luke decided, his voice carrying the certainty of destiny accepted. We free my father from his bonds, and we offer the Soul Render what no one has ever offered him before, the chance to choose love over hatred, compassion over cruelty, redemption over endless suffering. The will began to fade, but not before offering one final piece of guidance. Remember, children of light, that redemption is not a destination but a choice that must be made moment by moment, day by day. Even if you succeed in reaching the Soul Render's consciousness, his transformation will not be instant or easy. He will have to choose, again and again, to reject the darkness he has known for millions of years, and someone will have to be there to guide him through each moment of that choice. As the crystal prison began to dim, Luke understood that their mission had evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined. They were no longer just heroes seeking to save the galaxy. They had become teachers, preparing to offer the ultimate lesson in love and forgiveness to the universe's greatest enemy. The chain of sacrifice would either redeem them all or destroy them utterly. But in that moment, surrounded by companions willing to risk everything for the possibility of cosmic healing, Luke Skywalker knew there was no other choice they could make. The journey from the will's hidden chamber back to the surface of Arsis revealed changes that chilled Luke to his very core. The amber crystals scattered throughout the ruins had grown larger, their pulsing rhythm now synchronized with something vast and terrible stirring beneath the planet's surface. The robed figures conducting their dark rituals moved with increased urgency, their chanted invocations echoing across the devastated landscape like the death songs of a dying galaxy. But it was what Ahsoka discovered through her ship's enhanced sensors that truly revealed the scope of the threat they faced. The Soul Render's influence had spread far beyond Arsus itself, reaching out through the Force to touch worlds across the galaxy. "The reports are coming in from across known space," she said, her voice tight with growing alarm as she monitored communication channels that should have been impossible to access. Kor, Lusant, Naboo, Alderaan's memorial site, even distant worlds in the unknown regions. Everywhere that significant populations have died in the past 50 years, crystalline formations are beginning to emerge. Luke felt his blood run cold as he understood the implications. The Soul Render wasn't just preparing to harvest future souls, he was reaching back through time itself, claiming the spirits of those who had already passed into what they thought was peaceful rest. "The Death Star victims," Cal whispered, his face pale with horrified understanding. "Alderaan Jedha, everyone who died during the Galactic Civil War, their souls are being pulled back from whatever peace they had found." Through the Force, Luke could sense the truth of Cal's words. Across the galaxy, in places where great tragedies had occurred, reality itself was becoming thin. The boundaries between the world of the living and the Netherworld were dissolving, allowing the Soul Render to reach through and reclaim spirits he considered his property. "It's not just the recent dead," Isla added, her unique sensitivity to spiritual phenomena allowing her to perceive patterns the others could not. "I'm sensing disturbances around ancient battlefields, sites where the Mandalorian wars were fought, planets that were devastated during the Great Sith War. The Soul Render is claiming every soul that has ever died in conflict or tragedy." The magnitude of what they were witnessing defied comprehension. Millions of years of galactic history, Billions upon billions of souls who had passed into death, believing they would find rest, all of them being dragged into eternal imprisonment by an entity whose hunger for suffering knew no bounds. But even as the scope of the crisis became clear, Luke began to notice something else, a pattern within the chaos that offered a glimmer of hope. Not all of the dead were being claimed. Certain souls seemed to be protected, shielded by something that the soul render could not overcome. The redeemed ones, he said suddenly, understanding flooding through him like a revelation. Look at the pattern. Qui-Gon isn't being claimed. Neither is my father, despite his spiritual chains. The souls that found redemption before death, they have some kind of protection. Ahsoka nodded slowly, her enhanced perception confirming what Luke had intuited. It's not just redemption, it's the connections between souls, the bonds forged through love and sacrifice. The soul render can claim isolated spirits, souls that died alone or in despair, but he struggles against those who are anchored by genuine love. As if summoned by their growing understanding, the Force began to reveal deeper truths to them. Luke found his consciousness expanding beyond his physical form, drifting through layers of reality until he could perceive the vast spiritual network that connected all living things. What he saw there was both terrifying and magnificent. The soul render appeared as a massive spider-like entity, spinning webs of darkness throughout the galaxy, each strand reaching out to ensnare another suffering soul. But interwoven with his web of corruption was another pattern entirely, a network of light formed by the connections between souls who had chosen love over selfishness. Every act of genuine compassion, every sacrifice made for another's well-being, every moment when a being chose to place someone else's needs above their own, these created threads of light that the soul render could not break or corrupt. The galaxy was crisscrossed with these luminous connections, forming a vast tapestry of redemption that existed parallel to the web of spiritual darkness. "We're not alone," Luke breathed, his awareness returning to his physical form as the vision faded. Even now, even with the soul render at the height of his power, there are millions of souls connected by bonds of love that he cannot touch. Cal, who had been studying readings from his portable sensors, looked up with excitement. That's it. That's why the chain of sacrifice might actually work. We're not creating something new. We're tapping into a network that already exists. Every soul that has ever chosen redemption over corruption has added to this web of light. The understanding that flowed through Luke in that moment was staggering. His father's redemption had not been an isolated event, a single spark of light in an ocean of darkness. It had been part of a vast, ongoing process that had been building for millions of years. Every being who had ever chosen to turn away from selfishness, every act of genuine love and sacrifice, had contributed to a cosmic force for good that rivaled even the soul render's accumulated malevolence. "But there's more," Ayla said, her voice filled with wonder as her own perceptions expanded. "The network isn't just passive, it's actively fighting back against the soul render's influence. Every time he tries to claim a redeemed soul, the connections they've forged with others creates resistance." As if to demonstrate her point, one of the amber crystals in the distance suddenly flickered and went dark. Through the Force, they could all sense what had happened. A soul that the soul render had been attempting to claim had been protected by the love of those it had served in life, their combined spiritual energy forming a barrier that even cosmic evil could not penetrate. The ancient Jedi were wrong about detachment. Luke realized, the pieces of a vast puzzle finally falling into place. They taught that attachment led to the dark side, that love could become possessive and corrupting. But what they missed is that genuine love, the kind that desires only the beloved's happiness and well-being, creates connections that transcend even death itself. Ahsoka smiled, her expression carrying the wisdom of one who had walked away from the rigid doctrines of the old Jedi Order. Your father understood that in his final moments. When he chose to save you rather than preserve himself, he forged a connection that not even the Soul Render's chains could completely sever. The implications of what they were discovering began to reshape Luke's understanding of their entire mission. They were not attempting something unprecedented or impossible. They were joining a battle that had been raging since consciousness first emerged in the galaxy, a cosmic conflict between those who chose love and those who chose selfishness. "The chain of sacrifice," Cal said, his voice filled with growing confidence. "It's not just about the four of us. We're creating a bridge between the network of light and Anakin's imprisoned soul. Once that connection is established, the combined love of every redeemed soul in galactic history will flow through it." Luke felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he understood what Cal was describing. His father would not face his chains alone. The spiritual essence of every being who had ever chosen redemption over corruption would be there to support him, to remind him that love was stronger than guilt, that hope was more powerful than despair. But even as hope began to blossom in his heart, Luke sensed another presence stirring in the depths below the planet's surface. The Soul Render had become aware of their growing understanding, had perceived the threat that their knowledge represented to his carefully laid plans. The amber crystals throughout the ruins began to pulse faster, their rhythm becoming frantic as the entity poured more power into his ritual. The robed Sith Lords conducting the ceremony moved with supernatural speed, their chanted invocations rising to a fever pitch that made the very air around them vibrate with dark energy. "He knows," Ayla whispered, her face pale with the realization of what they faced. "The Soul Render understands what we're planning. He's accelerating his ritual, trying to complete the great harvest before we can forge our chain of sacrifice." Through the Force, Luke could sense the massive spiritual machinery that the ancient entity had constructed. Eons of preparation focused toward this single moment of cosmic conquest. The Soul Render had waited millions of years for the perfect alignment of circumstances, and he would not allow a handful of mortals to thwart his ultimate victory. "How long do we have?" Cal asked, though the growing intensity of the dark rituals around them suggested that time was running out faster than any of them had anticipated. Luke closed his eyes, extending his awareness through the Force to gauge the Soul Render's progress. What he sensed there filled him with both terror and determination. "Less than a day," he said quietly. "By this time tomorrow, either we will have forged the chain of sacrifice and begun the work of healing the galaxy's greatest wound, or every soul in known space will be trapped in eternal torment." Looking around at his companions, seeing their faces set with the same mixture of fear and resolve that he felt in his own heart, Luke Skywalker knew that they had reached the point of no return. The greatest battle in galactic history was about to begin, fought not with lightsabers or starships, but with the most powerful force in the universe. Love itself would be their weapon against the darkness. As the shadows lengthened across the ruins of Arsus and the Soul Render's ritual approached its terrifying culmination, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the galaxy. The network of light that Luke had perceived in his vision started to manifest itself in ways that defied all conventional understanding of how the Force operated. On distant worlds, in hidden temples and forgotten sanctuaries, beings who had never heard of the crisis on Arsus began to experience powerful visions. Jedi survivors scattered across the Outer Rim suddenly found themselves drawn to meditation, their consciousness touching something vast and urgent that called to every soul who had ever chosen redemption over revenge. Through Ahsoka's ship sensors, they began to receive transmissions that should have been impossible, voices speaking across impossible distances, not through technology, but through connections forged in the deepest layers of the Force itself. The first voice to reach them belonged to a figure Luke had only heard described in the most ancient Jedi texts. Master Yoda's own teacher, a being so old that his species had no name in current galactic languages, spoke to them from a world beyond the Outer Rim. Troubled, "The Force has become," the ancient voice whispered, carrying harmonics that spoke of wisdom accumulated over centuries beyond counting. "But gather those of light do. Unite we must, in ways not seen since the first days of the galaxy's youth." One by one, other voices joined the growing chorus. Jedi, who had survived Order 66 by going into deep hiding, Force-sensitive beings who had never received formal training, but whose hearts remained pure, even non-human species, whose connection to the mystical energy field took forms that traditional Jedi teaching had never recognized. From the forest moon of Endor came the voice of the Ewok shamans, their primitive language somehow conveying profound truths about the spiritual connections between all living things. The witches of Darth Vader added their knowledge of soul binding and release, their understanding of how consciousness could transcend the boundaries of individual existence. Even more surprising were the transmissions from unexpected sources. Mandalorian warriors whose honor codes had led them to redemptive sacrifice found their voices joining the growing network. Smugglers and rebels who had risked everything for others without thought of reward discovered that their acts of selfless courage had created connections they never knew existed. "The galaxy speaks," Isla said in wonder, her enhanced sensitivity allowing her to perceive the true scope of what was happening. "Every soul that has ever chosen love over hatred, compassion over cruelty, is reaching out across the void. They can sense what's at stake, even if they don't understand the specifics." Cole, who had been monitoring the transmissions on multiple frequencies, looked up with an expression of amazed discovery. "It's not just the living. I'm picking up resonances from spirits who have passed beyond, souls who achieved unity with the cosmic force, but are choosing to maintain some degree of individual consciousness to help with this crisis." Through the growing network of voices, Luke began to understand the true scope of the battle they were about to join. The Soul Render's web of corruption was vast, spanning millions of years and claiming billions of spirits, but the network of light was equally extensive. Every act of genuine love, every sacrifice made for another's well-being, every moment of redemption and forgiveness had created threads in a tapestry that covered the entire galaxy. "Listen," Ahsoka said suddenly, her head tilted, as if hearing something beyond normal perception. "There's something else, a voice I recognize but haven't heard in decades." The transmission that came through next made Luke's heart stop. It was a voice he had never heard while its owner lived, but which carried the unmistakable harmonics of family, of blood, calling to blood across the void of death. "Luke," came the gentle words of Padme Amidala, her spirit reaching out from whatever realm holds those who die in perfect love. "I have watched your journey, watched you struggle to understand your father's fate. Know that his redemption was real, that the love he showed in saving you burned away the darkness of 20 years in a single moment." The transmission grew stronger, as if Padme's spirit was drawing power from the very network of love that connected her to her son and the father of her children. "But know also that redemption is not just about erasing the past. It is about choosing, moment by moment, to serve love instead of fear. Your father will need guidance in learning to make that choice, not just once but continuously, for as long as consciousness endures." Luke felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to the mother he had never known speak about the father whose soul he was risking everything to save. But her words carried a warning as well as comfort. The Soul Render has never experienced genuine love, has never known the joy that comes from placing another's well-being above one's own desires. When you offer him redemption, he will not understand what you are giving him. He may reject it, may even be angered by it, because it represents everything he has spent millions of years trying to destroy. Other voices began to join Padme's, creating a chorus of wisdom that spanned the entirety of galactic history. Bail Organa spoke about the courage required to stand against overwhelming darkness. Mon Mothma added her understanding of how hope could survive even the bleakest circumstances. Even Han Solo's spirit contributed, his rough voice carrying hard-won knowledge about the redemptive power of love that transcends logic or self-interest. But perhaps the most important voice was one that Luke had been both hoping and dreading to hear. His father's spirit, still chained but somehow managing to speak across the barriers that imprisoned him. "My son," an Anakin's voice whispered, weak but filled with desperate love. "You must not sacrifice yourself for me. I chose my path, chose the darkness that led to these chains. Do not let my mistakes destroy your future." Luke leaned forward, speaking directly into the communication array. "Father, I'm not here to sacrifice myself. I'm here to teach you what I've learned about forgiveness, about the love that can heal even the deepest wounds. But I need you to trust me, to believe that redemption is possible even for the Soul Render himself." The silence that followed stretched for long moments before Anakin's voice returned, filled with amazement and something that might have been hope. "You would offer redemption to the entity that has tormented millions of souls, even after everything he has done, everything he represents. That's what love means, Father. It means offering second chances to those who seem most undeserving of them. It means believing that no soul is so far fallen that it cannot choose to climb back toward the light." Through the growing network of voices, Luke began to sense something that filled him with confidence despite the magnitude of the task ahead. The wisdom being shared was not just knowledge but understanding, the accumulated insight of every being who had ever chosen love over hatred, redemption over revenge. The ancient wills had been scholars and philosophers, beings of immense knowledge, but limited emotional understanding. They had approached the Soul Render as a problem to be solved rather than a soul to be healed. Their binding had been effective but temporary, a containment rather than a cure. But now, for the first time in galactic history, the Soul Render would face opponents who understood both the intellectual complexity of cosmic redemption and the emotional reality of transformative love. The chain of sacrifice that Luke and his companions were preparing to forge would carry with it the combined wisdom of every soul who had ever experienced genuine redemption. "The time comes," Master Yoda's familiar voice spoke through the network, his words carrying the authority of one who had guided the Jedi Order through its darkest hours. "Ready you are for the final choice. But remember, young Skywalkers all, that the greatest victories are won not through strength but through understanding, not through defeating enemies but through transforming them into friends." As the first stars began to appear in Ar-Sus's darkening sky, Luke looked around at his companions and felt a peace deeper than anything he had ever experienced. They were no longer just four individuals attempting an impossible task. They had become part of something vast and eternal, a network of love that connected every soul who had ever chosen light over darkness. Tomorrow they would forge the chain of sacrifice and venture into the Netherworld to face the accumulated evil of millions of years. But tonight, surrounded by the voices of everyone who had ever believed in the possibility of redemption, Luke Skywalker knew that love would find a way to triumph, no matter how terrible the darkness they were about to enter. The gathering of wisdom was complete. Now came the time for its application. The final hours before dawn brought changes to Ar-Sus that spoke of cosmic forces aligning in ways not seen since the birth of the galaxy itself. The amber crystals scattered throughout the ruins had grown to massive proportions, some towering higher than the ancient library spires themselves. Their pulsing had synchronized into a rhythm that seemed to match the very heartbeat of the universe, each pulse sending ripples through the force that could be felt across star systems. Luke stood with his companions at the edge of what had once been the great Jedi Library's central courtyard, now transformed into a nexus of spiritual energy so intense that reality itself seemed malleable around them. The robed Sith lords conducting their ritual had transcended their individual forms, becoming conduits for power that flowed directly from the Soul Render's prison in the Netherworld. The barriers between dimensions are dissolving, Ayla observed, her unique perception allowing her to see the fractures forming in the fabric of existence. In a few hours, this location will exist simultaneously in the physical universe and the realm of the dead. Cal consulted the ancient texts they had recovered from the deepest vaults, his enhanced understanding of Force techniques allowing him to interpret symbols that would have been meaningless to others. The ritual creates a bridging point, a place where the living can cross into the Netherworld without dying. But it also means that entities from that realm can manifest fully in our reality. The implications were staggering. If the Soul Render succeeded in completing his ritual, the boundary between life and death would collapse entirely around Arsus, creating a permanent gateway through which his influence could spread unchecked throughout the galaxy. But it was Ahsoka who voiced the question that had been weighing on all their minds as they prepared for what might be their final hours as individual beings. Are we truly ready for this? Once we forge the chain of sacrifice and enter the Netherworld, there may be no way back. Even if we succeed in freeing an Anakin and reaching the Soul Render, the transformation required might change us so fundamentally that we cease to exist as we understand existence. Luke looked at each of his companions, these remarkable beings who had chosen to stand with him despite knowing the price that might be demanded. Cal, barely into adulthood, but carrying wisdom earned through surviving the darkest period in Jedi history. A sailor who had already transcended death once and returned with knowledge that defied conventional understanding. Ahsoka, whose loyalty had survived the fall of everything she had once believed in. "I've been thinking about that," Luke said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had sustained him through every crisis of his young life. The ancient wills believed that confronting the Soul Render required complete dissolution of the self, becoming one with the cosmic force in a way that erased individual identity, but they were operating from fear, from the assumption that contact with such concentrated evil would inevitably lead to corruption. He gestured toward the growing network of light they could all sense pulsing through the Force, the connections between souls that spanned the galaxy and transcended death itself. What they missed is that love creates identity rather than erasing it. When we truly love someone, we don't lose ourselves in them. We become more ourselves, more complete, more capable of growth and change. The chain of sacrifice won't dissolve us into cosmic consciousness. It will make us more individual, more unique, while simultaneously connecting us to something greater than any one person could achieve alone. Alayla smiled, her expression carrying the serenity of one who had faced the ultimate unknown and emerged stronger. "You're describing something that the old Jedi Order never understood. They taught detachment as a defense against corruption, but what you're suggesting is attachment so complete, so selfless, that it becomes invulnerable to darkness." The truth of what they were attempting began to crystallize in Luke's mind with startling clarity. They were not just planning to rescue his father's soul or defeat an ancient evil. They were demonstrating a truth about the nature of love that could reshape how conscious beings understood their relationship to the Force itself. The Soul Render exists because beings throughout galactic history have believed that evil is stronger than good, that hatred is more powerful than love, that destruction is easier than creation, Luke continued, his understanding deepening with each word. But we're about to prove that he's wrong on the most fundamental level possible. Cal looked up from his texts with sudden excitement. That's it. That's why the chain of sacrifice might actually work where the will's binding failed. We're not trying to imprison the Soul Render or destroy him. We're offering to teach him something he's never experienced, what it feels like to be truly loved, unconditionally and without reservation. The concept was so radical, so unprecedented in the history of galactic conflict, that it took several moments for its full implications to sink in. They were preparing to face the accumulated evil of millions of years, not with weapons or barriers, but with the most vulnerable gift imaginable: complete, open-hearted love offered to someone who had never shown anything but malevolence. "It will require perfect trust," Ahsoka warned, though her voice carried wonder rather than fear. "Not just trust in each other, but trust in the Force itself. Trust that love really is the most powerful force in the universe. The moment we doubt, the moment we hold back any part of ourselves out of fear or self-preservation, the chain will shatter." Luke nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was describing. They would have to open their hearts completely, become vulnerable in ways that most beings never allowed themselves to experience, even with their closest loved ones, and they would have to maintain that openness while confronting an entity whose very existence was antithetical to everything they believed about the possibility of goodness. "There's something else," Cal added, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "According to these texts, the Soul Render isn't just evil by choice. He's evil by nature, created from the accumulated selfishness and cruelty of millions of years. Offering him redemption might be like trying to convince fire not to burn or water not to flow downhill." The comparison sent a chill through the group, but it was Luke who found the response that rekindled their hope. "Fire can be tamed to warm a home instead of burning it down. Water can be channeled to nourish life instead of causing floods. Even the most fundamental forces of nature can be transformed when they encounter something they've never experienced before. And the Soul Render, for all his cosmic power, has never encountered genuine unconditional love." As if responding to their growing determination, the Force itself began to manifest around them in ways that defied description. The air shimmered with barely visible threads of light, connections forming between their spirits that strengthened with each moment of shared resolve. This was the beginning of the chain of sacrifice, bonds forged not through ritual or technique, but through genuine care for each other's well-being. "I can feel it," Alayla breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "The network of light is focusing through us, channeling the love of every redeemed soul in galactic history. We're becoming conduits for something larger than ourselves." Through the growing connection, Luke began to sense his father's presence more clearly than ever before. Anakin's spirit remained chained in the depths of the Soul Render's prison, but the bonds were weakening as the network of light pressed against them. For the first time since learning of his father's spiritual imprisonment, Luke felt genuine confidence that their mission could succeed. "The sunrise will bring the final alignment," Cal observed, noting the way the amber crystals were responding to approaching dawn. "The Soul Render will complete his ritual and attempt the great harvest, but by then we'll already be in the Netherworld, carrying with us the combined love of everyone who has ever chosen redemption over revenge." Luke looked up at the stars fading in the pre-dawn sky, thinking of all the worlds that hung in the balance, all the souls who would face eternal imprisonment if they failed. But he also thought of the network of light pulsing through the Force, the connections between beings who had chosen to love despite every reason for hatred. "Then let's forge the chain completely," he decided, extending his hands toward his companions. "Let's show the universe what love can accomplish when it refuses to surrender to darkness." As their hands joined, and the final bonds of the chain of sacrifice locked into place, Luke Skywalker felt his individual consciousness expand to encompass something vast and eternal, while somehow remaining completely, uniquely himself. The moment the chain of sacrifice completed itself, reality exploded around them in ways that transcended every conventional understanding of existence. Luke felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his physical form, while somehow remaining completely anchored in his individual identity. Through the chain he could perceive his companions not just as separate beings, but as essential parts of a greater whole, each one contributing unique strengths to their collective purpose. The transition into the Netherworld was not the violent crossing they had expected, but rather a gradual shift in perception, as if they were simply becoming aware of layers of reality that had always existed but remained hidden from normal sight. The ruined landscape of Arsus faded around them, replaced by a realm that existed in the spaces between dimensions, where thought became substance and emotion took physical form. What they found there defied every expectation they had harbored about the nature of the afterlife. The Netherworld was not a single unified realm, but rather an infinite collection of sub-dimensions, each one reflecting the spiritual state of the souls contained within it. Some areas pulsed with serene light, places where redeemed spirits existed in states of perfect peace. Others writhed with darkness so intense it seemed to devour light itself. Prisons where corrupted souls tormented themselves with eternally recursive cycles of guilt and hatred. But it was what lay at the center of this cosmic maze that truly staggered them. The Soul Render's domain was not merely a place but a living entity in its own right, a vast spiderweb of crystallized suffering that stretched across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each strand of the web was formed from the spiritual essence of trapped souls, beings whose anguish had been transmuted into the very architecture of cosmic evil. "By the Force," Cal whispered, his consciousness reeling from the scope of what they were perceiving. "The souls aren't just imprisoned here. They've been transformed into the prison itself. The Soul Render has turned their suffering into the foundation of his power." Through the chain, Luke could sense his companions struggling to maintain their sanity in the face of such concentrated malevolence. But the bonds between them held firm, each one drawing strength from the other's determination, while contributing their own unique understanding to their collective awareness. And there, suspended in the center of the web like the ultimate trophy of cosmic conquest, hung the spirit of Anakin Skywalker. Luke's father appeared exactly as he had in the visions, wrapped in chains forged from pure guilt and self-hatred. But seeing him directly through the enhanced perception of the chain revealed details that no vision could have conveyed. The chains were not merely restraints but feeding tubes, constantly draining away an Anakin's spiritual energy to power the Soul Render's ever-expanding web of corruption. "Father," Luke called out, his voice somehow carrying across the impossible distances of the Netherworld. "We're here, we're going to free you." And Anakin's head lifted slowly, his eyes focusing on the four figures approaching through the web of crystallized suffering. But instead of hope, his expression showed only desperate terror. "No," he gasped, his voice echoing with the accumulated anguish of decades of spiritual imprisonment. "You don't understand. This is what I deserve. This is what I chose when I fell to the dark side. You have to leave me here and save yourselves." It was then that the Soul Render himself manifested, his presence causing reality to twist and buckle around them. The entity was far more terrible than Luke had imagined, not because of any physical horror, but because of the sheer weight of despair that emanated from his form. This was not merely an evil being, but the living embodiment of every cruel choice ever made, every moment when a conscious creature had chosen selfishness over compassion. So the Soul Render spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from every dimension simultaneously. "The young teacher comes to offer redemption to that which exists only to corrupt redemption itself." How perfectly naive! The entity's attention turned to Luke with an intensity that threatened to shatter his individual consciousness. "Do you truly believe, young Skywalker, that love is stronger than the accumulated hatred of millions of years? Do you think your pathetic attachment to this broken soul can overcome the cosmic weight of his crimes?" Luke felt the Soul Render's malevolence pressing against the bonds of the chain, testing their strength, probing for weaknesses that could be exploited. But instead of fear, he felt something else growing within him, something that drew power from every connection in the network of light that spanned the galaxy. "I believe," Luke said quietly, his voice somehow carrying perfect clarity through the chaos of the Netherworld, that every soul deserves the chance to choose love over hatred, no matter what they've done in the past. The Soul Render's laughter was like the sound of stars dying, a cosmic expression of mockery that sent ripples of despair through multiple dimensions. Then you are more foolish than I imagined. Observe what your father truly is. The chains around Anakin began to glow, and suddenly Luke could perceive every act of cruelty his father had committed during his years as Darth Vader. The slaughter at the Jedi Temple, the murder of younglings, the destruction of entire worlds in service to the Empire. Each atrocity played out in vivid detail, accompanied by the screams of the innocent and the weeping of those left behind. This is the being you seek to redeem, the Soul Render continued, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. A creature so steeped in evil that his very existence is an affront to the concept of justice. He belongs here in chains forged from his own guilt, and you, by seeking to free him, prove that redemption itself is nothing more than cosmic delusion. Luke felt his companions wavering through the chain, their faith shaken by the overwhelming evidence of Anakin's crimes. But it was at that moment that he remembered something crucial, a truth that the Soul Render in all his cosmic arrogance had failed to understand. "You're right," Luke said, his admission causing shock to ripple through both his companions and the Soul Render himself. "My father did all those things. He chose darkness, chose cruelty, chose to serve evil for decades, and every soul he destroyed, every life he ended, every act of brutality he committed, all of it was real and unforgivable." The Soul Render leaned forward with anticipation, believing that Luke was about to abandon his mission and accept the futility of redemption. But Luke's next words shattered that expectation completely. But he also chose love. In his final moments, faced with the choice between saving himself and saving his son, he chose love. And that single act of genuine sacrifice, that one moment of putting someone else's well-being above his own survival, carries more weight in the cosmic balance than all the evil that came before. Luke stepped closer to his father's suspended form, ignoring the Soul Render's growing rage. "That's what you've never understood, isn't it? You think evil is addition, that each cruel act makes you stronger, builds towards some ultimate victory over good. But love isn't addition. Love is transformation. One genuine act of selfless love can rewrite the entire meaning of a lifetime of cruelty." Through the chain of sacrifice, Luke began to channel not just his own love for his father, but the accumulated compassion of every soul in the network of light. The love of Padme, who had seen good in Anakin even as he fell to darkness. The forgiveness of Obi-Wan, who had never stopped believing that his former apprentice could be redeemed. The understanding of every being who had ever chosen mercy over vengeance. "This is impossible," the Soul Render snarled, his form beginning to waver as unfamiliar energies washed over him. "Love is weakness. Compassion is delusion. The strong devour the weak, and cruelty triumphs over kindness. This is the fundamental law of existence." But Luke was no longer listening to the entity's protests. Through the chain, he reached out to his father's chained spirit, offering not just rescue but something far more profound, complete, unconditional forgiveness for everything Anakin had done as Darth Vader. "I forgive you, Father," Luke said, his words carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "Not because your crimes weren't terrible, but because love is stronger than guilt, and hope is more powerful than despair." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The chains around Anakin began to crack and shatter, their power source of guilt and self-hatred disrupted by the offering of unconditional forgiveness. But more than that, the very foundations of the Soul Render's domain began to shake as an energy he had never encountered before flooded through his realm of crystallized suffering. For the first time in millions of years, the Soul Render was experiencing genuine love offered without condition or reservation, compassion extended even to the most undeserving recipient, and the experience was transforming him in ways that terrified him more than any threat he had ever faced. "What are you doing to me?" he whispered, his cosmic arrogance replaced by confusion and something that might have been hope. "What is this power? Why doesn't it seek to control or corrupt me?" Luke smiled, understanding flooding through him as he witnessed the birth of wonder in a being who had known nothing but malevolence for eons. "This is love," he said gently, extending the same unconditional compassion to the Soul Render that he had offered to his father. "This is what it feels like to be valued not for what you can give or what you can do, but simply for existing. This is what redemption truly means." And for the first time since conscious beings had learned to choose cruelty over kindness, the accumulated evil of millions of years began to weep. The transformation that began within the Soul Render rippled outward through every dimension of the Netherworld, causing changes that no being in galactic history had ever witnessed. The crystalline web of suffering that had formed his domain began to resonate with new frequencies, harmonics of hope and possibility that had never existed in those dark realms before. Luke watched in amazement as the entity who had embodied cosmic evil for millions of years struggled to understand the experience of being loved without condition. The Soul Render's form, which had appeared as concentrated darkness given malevolent consciousness, began to shift and change, revealing glimpses of what he might have been before eons of accumulated cruelty had corrupted his essential nature. "I don't understand," the Soul Render whispered, his voice no longer carrying the cosmic arrogance that had defined him for so long. "How can you offer me compassion after witnessing what I am, what I have done? I am the living embodiment of every cruel choice ever made. I exist only to increase suffering in the universe." Through the chain of sacrifice, Luke drew upon the wisdom of every soul in the network of light, finding words that carried the accumulated understanding of billions of beings who had chosen redemption over revenge. "You became what you are because no one ever showed you another way," Luke replied, his voice filled with gentle certainty. "For millions of years you've been fed nothing but hatred and cruelty, taught that power comes from causing pain, that strength means making others suffer, but that was never your choice. You were created by the actions of others, shaped by forces beyond your control." The Soul Render's confusion deepened, but alongside it grew something that he had never experienced before, genuine curiosity about the nature of love rather than a desire to corrupt it. "But if I am not responsible for what I became," he asked with the hesitancy of one exploring entirely new concepts, "then what am I truly? Who was I before the first cruel choice was made to feed my existence?" It was an Anakin who answered, his spirit now free of the chains that had bound him, his consciousness cleared of the guilt and self-hatred that had clouded his perception for so long. "You were possibility," Anakin said, his voice carrying the wisdom earned through experiencing both the depths of corruption and the heights of redemption. "Before conscious beings learned to choose cruelty, before the first act of selfishness created the wound you became, you were pure potential. The universe's capacity for growth, for change, for becoming something greater than what existed before." The revelation hit the Soul Render with the force of a collapsing star. He had spent millions of years believing himself to be the ultimate expression of cosmic evil, the inevitable result of consciousness itself. But what Anakin was describing was something entirely different, a being who had been corrupted rather than choosing corruption, a force for potential good that had been twisted into its opposite by the accumulated cruelty of others. "I was meant to help souls grow," he whispered, the understanding dawning like the first sunrise after endless night. "I was supposed to be the force that challenged beings to become better than they were, to choose love over fear, compassion over cruelty. But instead of challenging them toward growth, I became the embodiment of every failure to grow. Cal, his consciousness still linked through the chain, added his own understanding to the growing revelation. The ancient texts I studied spoke of a force in the universe that tested souls, that presented them with choices that would reveal their true nature. Not evil itself, but the catalyst that allowed beings to discover whether they would choose light or darkness when faced with genuine challenges. Adula's enhanced perception allowed her to see even deeper into the soul render's transformation. You were never meant to be destroyed or imprisoned. You were meant to be redeemed, transformed back into your original purpose. The wills understood part of the truth when they bound you, but they missed the crucial element. You can't heal a wound by hiding it. You can only heal it by offering it the love it was denied. The soul render began to weep then, cosmic tears that carried within them the accumulated sorrow of every cruel choice he had been forced to embody. But these were not tears of despair. They were tears of relief, the release that comes when a soul finally understands its true purpose after eons of believing itself irredeemably evil. "Can I choose differently now?" he asked, with the vulnerability of a child seeking guidance. "Can I learn to challenge souls toward growth rather than corruption? Can I become what I was meant to be before the first act of cruelty shaped me into something monstrous?" Luke felt his heart swell with compassion for this being who had been galactic civilization's greatest enemy, but who was now revealing himself to be its most tragic victim. "Redemption is always a choice," he said gently, "and it's a choice that must be made not once but continually, moment by moment, day by day. I can't transform you. Father couldn't transform you. Only you can choose to become who you truly are." The soul render nodded slowly, understanding beginning to replace the confusion in his cosmic consciousness. "Then I choose to learn. I choose to discover what love truly means, to understand how to challenge souls toward growth rather than corruption. But I will need teachers. I will need beings who understand both the depths of darkness and the heights of redemption to guide me." Anakin stepped forward, his spirit now radiating the peace that comes from complete forgiveness and self-acceptance. "I know what it's like to believe yourself irredeemably evil," he said, with quiet authority. "I know the weight of carrying the suffering you've caused others, the way guilt can become chains stronger than any physical bondage. If you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach you what I've discovered about the path from darkness to light." The transformation that followed transcended anything that had ever occurred in the history of the galaxy. The soul render's domain of crystallized suffering began to dissolve, not through destruction but through metamorphosis. Each strand of his web, each imprisoned soul, each monument to cosmic evil was touched by the transformative power of genuine love and began to change. Souls who had been trapped in cycles of guilt and self-hatred for millennia found themselves offered the same unconditional forgiveness that Luke had given to Anakin. Spirits who had believed themselves beyond redemption discovered that love was indeed stronger than any evil they had committed. The very architecture of the Netherworld began to shift from a realm of punishment to a place of healing and growth. But perhaps the most profound change was in the soul render himself. As he accepted the love being offered and began to understand his true nature, his form evolved from concentrated darkness to something far more complex and beautiful. He became a being of infinite possibility, a force that could challenge souls to grow while offering them the support and guidance they needed to make positive choices. "This will take time," he said, his voice now carrying harmonics of hope rather than despair. "I have millions of years of accumulated patterns to change, eons of believing in the supremacy of cruelty to overcome. But with teachers like you, with the understanding that love is truly stronger than hatred, I believe I can learn to become what I was always meant to be." Through the chain of sacrifice, Luke could sense the effects of this transformation spreading far beyond the Netherworld. Across the galaxy, in every place where the Soul Render's influence had been felt, new possibilities were being born. The amber crystals on Arsus were dissolving into particles of pure light, carrying with them the potential for spiritual growth rather than imprisonment. The network of light grows stronger. Ah, Sokar observed, her consciousness expanding to encompass the vast web of connections between all souls who had chosen love over hatred. Every being who witnesses this transformation, every soul who experiences the reality that redemption is possible even for cosmic evil itself, adds their own thread to the tapestry of hope. Luke looked around at his companions, these remarkable beings who had risked everything to prove that love was indeed the most powerful force in the universe. The chain of sacrifice that had bound them together in their mission was transforming as well, becoming not just a tool for accessing other dimensions, but a permanent connection between souls who had chosen to place others' well-being above their own. "We did it," Cal said with wonder in his voice. "We actually did it. We didn't just free an Anakin's soul or prevent the great harvest. We healed the universe's greatest wound through the simple act of offering unconditional love to someone who seemed completely undeserving of it." But Luke knew that their true victory lay not in what they had accomplished, but in what they had demonstrated about the nature of existence itself. They had proven that no soul, no matter how corrupted or fallen, was beyond the reach of redemptive love. They had shown that the universe's capacity for healing was greater than its capacity for harm. And perhaps most importantly, they had established a new understanding of what it meant to be truly alive in a galaxy where love had proven itself stronger than death, stronger than evil, stronger than the accumulated darkness of millions of years. The journey back to the realm of the living was like awakening from the most profound dream ever experienced, a gradual return to physical awareness that brought with it the knowledge that everything had fundamentally changed. Luke opened his eyes to find himself lying on the soft grass of Arsus, but the world around him bore no resemblance to the devastated planet they had left behind. Where once there had been crystalline monuments to suffering, now gentle wildflowers swayed in warm breezes that carried the scent of new growth and infinite possibility. The ruins of the great Jedi library had been transformed as well, its broken walls now overgrown with vines that pulsed with soft, natural light. The very air seemed to shimmer with the presence of the Force flowing freely, no longer corrupted by the Soul Render's malevolent influence, but pure and welcoming. His companions stirred around him, each one returning to physical consciousness with expressions of profound peace. The chain of sacrifice that had bound them during their journey into the Netherworld had not disappeared, but had evolved, becoming a permanent connection between souls who had shared the universe's most profound act of redemption. Through this bond, Luke could sense their contentment, their deep satisfaction at having witnessed love triumph over even cosmic evil. "It's beautiful," Isla whispered, sitting up slowly and gazing around at the transformed landscape. Her enhanced perception of spiritual energies revealed layers of harmony that had never existed here before, patterns of light and growth that spoke of healing on the deepest possible level. Cal rose to his feet with the fluid grace of someone who had transcended the limitations of purely physical existence. His connection to ancient Force techniques had been permanently enhanced by their journey, allowing him to perceive the subtle ways that the galaxy itself had been transformed by what they had accomplished. "The network of light spans every inhabited system now," he said, with wonder in his voice. "Every soul that witnessed our confrontation with the Soul Render, every being who felt the moment when cosmic evil chose redemption over revenge, they're all connected now. The galaxy has become something it never was before." Ahsoka stood beside them, her presence radiating the calm authority of someone who had helped reshape the fundamental nature of existence. "The Force itself is different," she observed, her consciousness touching the mystical energy field that connected all living things. "It's not just light and dark anymore, not just a balance between opposing forces. it's become something unified, something that encompasses growth and possibility rather than conflict. Through their enhanced connection to the Force, they could sense the changes spreading throughout known space. On distant worlds, beings who had lived in fear of death were discovering that mortality no longer meant separation from those they loved. The network of light that connected all redeemed souls had become visible to anyone willing to perceive it, offering comfort to the grieving and hope to the despairing. The Sith tombs on Ban had been transformed into gardens where beings came to meditate on the possibility of redemption. The site where Alderaan had once existed now glowed with gentle radiance, a memorial not to destruction, but to the resilience of love in the face of ultimate loss. Even the ruins of the Death Stars had become pilgrimage destinations, where beings gathered to celebrate the triumph of choice over destiny. But perhaps the most profound change was one that could only be perceived through the Force itself. The Soul Render, now transformed into his true nature as a catalyst for spiritual growth, had become a presence that challenged beings throughout the galaxy to become their best selves. No longer did souls face temptation toward darkness without support and guidance. Instead, they found themselves offered choices that revealed their capacity for love while providing the strength to choose wisely. "He's learning," Luke said softly, his consciousness touching the transformed entity that had once threatened to harvest every soul in existence. Through their connection, he could sense the Soul Render's journey toward understanding, guided by Anakin's patient teaching, and supported by the love of every redeemed soul in the galaxy. The process was not without its challenges. Millions of years of believing in the supremacy of cruelty could not be overcome in a single moment of transformation. But with each choice to offer growth rather than corruption, each decision to challenge souls toward love rather than hatred, the being who had once been cosmic evil discovered new depths to his true nature. "Father is at peace now," Luke continued, feeling Anakin's presence in the Force as a warm, steady light that would never again be dimmed by guilt or self-hatred. "The chains are truly broken. Not just the ones that bound him in the Netherworld, but the ones he carried in his heart. He understands now that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to serve love in the present moment." Through their shared connection, Luke could perceive his father's new role in the cosmic order. Anakin had become a guide for souls, making the transition from life to whatever lay beyond. His unique understanding of both corruption and redemption, making him the perfect counselor for those who struggled with guilt and self-forgiveness. "The galaxy will remember this," Cal said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "Not as a battle between good and evil, but as the moment when the universe learned that love is truly unconditional, that redemption is always possible, that no soul is ever truly lost." As the afternoon sun began to set over the transformed landscape of Arsus, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to carry the very essence of hope, the four companions found themselves drawn to the site where the great Jedi library had once stood. The ancient seat of learning had become something new, a garden of contemplation where beings from across the galaxy would come to study not just the techniques of the Force, but the deeper mysteries of love and forgiveness. "Our work here is done," Ahsoka said, though her voice carried no sadness at the thought of parting. The chain of sacrifice that connected them ensured that they would never truly be separated, that the bonds forged in their journey to redeem cosmic evil itself would endure for as long as consciousness existed. Luke looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, each one representing worlds where beings were discovering new possibilities for growth and connection. The network of light that spanned the galaxy pulsed with the combined love of every soul who had ever chosen redemption, creating a cosmic web of support that would guide future generations toward their highest potential. "Thank you," he said quietly, his words addressed not just to his companions, but to every being who had contributed to their mission. Thank you for proving that love really is the most powerful force in the universe, that no darkness is too deep for light to penetrate, that redemption is always possible for those willing to accept it. The gentle wind that stirred the grass around them seemed to carry responses from across the galaxy, whispers of gratitude from souls who had been touched by what they had witnessed, promises from beings who would carry forward the lesson that love transcends even death itself. As the stars grew brighter, and the peaceful sounds of Sissy's transformed ecosystem created a natural lullaby, Luke Skywalker settled into meditation with the profound contentment of someone who had helped heal the universe's deepest wound. The Force flowed around him like a gentle river, carrying with it the eternal truth that had been proven beyond all doubt. Love was indeed stronger than hatred, hope more powerful than despair, and redemption always possible for those courageous enough to offer it freely. In the cosmic dance of existence, the galaxy had learned to choose light over darkness, growth over stagnation, love over fear. And somewhere in the space between dimensions, Anakin Skywalker's spirit smiled with perfect peace, knowing that his son had fulfilled a destiny greater than any prophecy could have imagined.